Gerard, thanks very much for taking the interview today. Could you tell me a little bit about your political background?
I'm 90 now, and my background is I grew up in a Charlestown neighborhood, which was right on the waterfront, and in about 1850, when the Irish came into Boston, they all landed in Charlestown, where I was. And so when I graduated from a Catholic high school, I started off and I went to Harvard, which was unusual for Catholics and Irish going there. And just as I finished my high school, in front of our house was a parade route celebrating the Battle of Bunker Hill, which was the first battle in the American Revolution. And we had a lot of people over to our house. The parade went by our house. And almost immediately, in the first group of marches was a scraggly group of 5. It was led by a very skinny fellow with a soft hat on, and the other 4, my father knew a little bit. The parade stopped in front of the house. My father made lemonade and went out and gave it to the marchers and introduced himself to the fellow with the hat on. The fellow in the hat was surprised that I had just been accepted to go to Harvard. He had gone to Harvard, and we chatted a little bit. And as he was leaving, he said, "Oh, I am running for Congress next week." My father says, "I know, and we're going to help you." He says, "I hope I can win." And I said, "We will." My father said, "We will help you." So he ended up getting elected to Congress. And then back and forth, I went to Harvard, had to leave school. I had tuberculosis for 2 years, and then when I came back, he was running for the Senate. And I met him again, and he was very friendly, and we talked, and then he became the United States Senator. And then I had the opportunity to get elected to the legislature from my district, and I got elected. And the day of our swearing in, Senator John Kennedy had a reception for newly elected people, and when I went into the room, I was the only one he really knew. So we made a lot of it, and I became very friendly with him, and he was very helpful. His people were helpful, and I would do a lot of Mickey Mouse things, and I was in the legislature for about 1.5 years, and John Kennedy ran for re-election, and I had some functions for him, and he liked them. And then about 1 year later, after he got elected to the Senate, he called me and he said, "Do you know my younger brother, Teddy?" I said, "No." And he said, "Well, I want you to meet him. And you're a workhorse. I want you to help him get elected to the United States Senate." So I met Teddy, and we had not a perfect union, but a pretty good union for that time for the next 40 years. And Teddy got elected, and then he was in office for 2 years. It was a short term, and he was running for re-election, and he had made me Democratic state chairman, and we had all sorts of problems and brewing at the convention. So I called him and asked him if he could come early. So he came a day early, except we were in Springfield, which is the western part of the state. And he was flying in, and it was an 8-seat plane, and it was struck by lightning, and it crashed. And as I said, there was 8 seats, 4 were killed, and Ted Kennedy survived. But he was in such serious condition, they took him to a local hospital, and I got there about midnight, and there were supposedly 6 life signs. He only had 1, and the prognosis was he wasn't going to live the night. Anyway, after a lot of prayers and thoughts, and he developed so that he all had his 6 major senses. And as a consequence, He was in the western part of the state where, by coincidence, my wife and I had a home. So every weekend we would go to the home, and we would go about 20 miles. I would go about 20 miles to visit him in the hospital in Northampton, Massachusetts. He was in the hospital there for 6 months, and every Saturday I would go and I'd bring his ice cream and would watch a movie, and then we would talk about health. And he asked me what other nations did, and I told him Finland did very well. And then the next Saturday he said, I want more information. So the 8 months he was there, we learned about health systems, and all Americans should have it. His problem was, as he projected himself early, the medical profession thought he was going to have almost unionized medicine, and they were all opposed to him. But he continued and returned to the Senate, and that's all he did for 40 years. There were other major things he was involved in, but his major role was a health system for everybody. And through the 40 years, he developed a system which is a great advance in terms of how it was before. He was active in other areas, but healthcare is probably his greatest monument and his greatest accomplishment. And during that period, his brother, Robert, the president, decided not to run again, and Robert ran for the Senate. Robert couldn't get any kind of support from the political community. They were afraid of him. He was independent. He was uncontrollable. And so Ted Kennedy asked me if I would help him in his campaign, where he had a carrier state, which was Indiana, which was very conservative. And so, much to everybody's amazement, he ended up winning in Indiana. And the night of the election, he asked me to go on television with him, and we were on together. And afterwards, he and I and his wife were still at the studio, and we sat alone. And he said, for all these years, you've been considered to be Teddy's friend, and what you did for me today in these last several months, you proved to be my friend. And he said, will you help me continue? And I said I would, but I'd been away from my law practice for about a month. But after the month, I would come back and run your campaign in New York. Anyway, on the 3rd of June, which was about 5 weeks later, my bags were packed. My wife and I went up to bed at 11 o'clock. We were watching the victory of Robert Kennedy in California, and then the news came on, he was killed. And that was, a very sad experience. And then I continued to help Ted Kennedy right up until his death. And it was a wonderful experience for me. And the great thing was his commitment to health care changed the thinking of everybody in the United States, and that was really his greatest accomplishment. And I ended up being one of his first mourners. His wife asked me if I would sit at the coffin the first day of public viewing. And my wife and I sat there for 4 hours. And we've had probably maybe about 30 people grieving. But one of the things that popped out was about 20 of them asked the same question. And the question was, your family didn't have money, you didn't go to private schools, how did you become friendly with Ted Kennedy? And what I did was I started to tell them the story that I've told you today. And several people said, you know what you ought to do? You ought to write a book. So I wrote the book, and the book has taken me to Ireland, and we're going to publicize it. We have sold about 2,000 of the books in the United States, and people are very interested. But always with the Kennedys, the place was dear to them, was Ireland. The district I grew up in was right on the edge of Boston and the harbor, and when the boats came from Killybegs to Boston, all the people from Donegal got off and stayed in this one district, which is Charlestown, and which supported me in the legislature, and I feel I was very, very happy. But the whole thing turned around about my life with Ted Kennedy. You know, I made cereal for him. I fought with him. We laughed together. We cried together. But one of the things that was amazing, he always would search out people who had problems, and he would try to help their problems. And as busy as he was, he always found time, and he impressed upon me. Let's look for the little guy. Let's look for the women. Let's look for people who need help. And some say the Kennedys had a guilt complex, that they wanted to keep doing things. And other observers said, well, you know, he could have got when he got elected, or any of the Kennedys got elected, they could have gotten on a boat, sailed around the world this way, and then came back and sailed around that way, and really didn't have to accomplish anything. The amazing thing about them is they worked like hell. They worked 18 hours a day, not to improve their own self, because they had all the financial things that are necessary, but to help the little guy.
Perfect. And could you tell me a little bit about your relationship in the role you had with Jimmy Carter as his campaign director?
I never met Jimmy Carter. He ended up in 1976 running for president. He had some very strong candidates running against him, except he was able to do very well in the southern states, in the western states. And he ended up surprising everybody, and he won the nomination. Some people felt that he had very little experience in industrial states, and they came to me and asked me if I would run his campaign, and I said, no, I don't want to do it. So over about a month and a half period of time, they climbed all over me, and then so finally Ted Kennedy said, why don't you go and help? And I said, well, you know, I don't want to go there for money. And one of the things which is important for me and to other people is, as long as in many years that I worked for him, I was never paid. And that's an interesting story. When he first was running, and right after he won the convention, everybody was jumping up and down, including his family, and they offered to pay me. I got very excited. I went home that night, and my father, as I said earlier, only went to third grade in school, was a fireman. He asked me how I was doing, and I said, fine. And he said, you and your wife, do you have any debts? And I said, we owe $50 on a sofa. And he said, the Kennedys want to pay you. I said, yeah. He said, we don't work for pay in issues like this. We do it because we feel it's the right thing. So for 45 years, I was never paid, and I never wanted to be paid. And my father said, you know, if they don't pay you, they can't fire you. You can quit, and that's the honorable way to be. And so that's what I did for the 40 some odd years with the Kennedys.
And finally, Gerard, could you tell me a little bit about American politics now and how much it's changed since you began?
One of the things that bothers me, and maybe it's an ego trip on my part, but one of the things that bothers me now about American politics is many of the people who work in it, they're highly paid, and it becomes a business. When I was active, together with a lot of other people, they did it because of their beliefs. I'm very concerned with the commercialization of politics. And for somebody today, some bright young man or woman, what they have to do is raise a lot of money, and it just is beginning to dwarf some people who have initiative, who have talent, but don't have any money. In those days, when you ran for office, the fellow next door helped you, the woman across the street helped you, but that's one of the things that's changed. I mean, it just is now a big money business.